Sophie Cunningham did not yell. She never mentioned Brittney Griner by name, but within minutes, social media had already made the connection. She did not rant, she just said exactly what she believed, and within minutes, the WNBA had another full-blown firestorm on its hands. That is what made this moment so explosive, because this was not some offhand comment buried in a random interview. This came right after another Indiana Fever game, another Caitlin Clark game, another game where fans once again walked away talking about contact, officiating, frustration, and whether the league is really protecting its biggest star. And then, after the final buzzer, Sophie Cunningham stepped in front of the cameras and said something that instantly pushed the story beyond basketball, not just beyond one game, beyond one team, beyond one rivalry, into one of the biggest cultural debates in sports. And whether you agree with her or not, one thing is obvious. She knew exactly what she was saying. She was not afraid to say it, and the timing was never going to let it land quietly. So let's break down what actually happened, what Sophie said, why social media immediately connected her comments to Brittney Griner, why Caitlin Clark's night made the whole thing even more combustible, and why Indiana hanging 123 points on Connecticut somehow still was not the biggest story by the end of the night. Because this was not just one quote, it was one quote landing on top of months of tension that had already been building around the Fever, around Clark, and around the league itself. And when something that charged finally gets said out loud, the reaction is never small. What Sophie actually said. After the game, Sophie Cunningham was asked to expand on her views about protecting women's sports and protecting young girls in those spaces. She did not dodge it. She never mentioned Brittney Griner by name during this answer, but many viewers quickly linked her comments to the broader debate online. She called it common sense. She said it is important to protect girls. And she made it clear she was not backing away from that position. Later in the exchange, she added something else that mattered just as much. She said she did not hate anyone. She said there is room for everyone. But she also said she believes biological women have rights that need to be protected and that she would stand true to that. That combination is what made the clip explode. Because it was not emotional chaos. It was not a screaming match. It was not sloppy wording. It was calm. It was direct. And it sounded like something she had thought through long before that microphone got in front of her face. That kind of delivery changes everything. Fans can forgive a rant as heat-of-the-moment emotion, but when a player sounds composed, clear, and unbothered while saying something controversial, people treat it differently. They assume intention. And in this case, intention is exactly what people started debating. Was this just Sophie stating a broad belief? Was it a deliberate message aimed at the league? Was it connected to what had just happened on the floor? Within minutes, the internet decided it was all of the above. Why fans immediately linked it to Brittney Griner. Now here is where this story becomes much more volatile. Sophie Cunningham did not stand there and directly say Brittney Griner's name in that specific answer. That matters. But many fans on social media did not need her to say the name to start connecting the dots, and the reason is simple: timing. This happened after another game where Caitlin Clark had once again been involved in physical sequences, frustration with the whistle, and another growing pile of fan complaints about how contact around her gets handled. It also happened in a broader climate where Brittney Griner had already become tied to online debate anytime her name came up alongside Clark's. So when Sophie chose that exact moment to take a strong public stand on protecting women's sports, a large part of the audience did not hear it in a vacuum. Many viewers interpreted it through the context of the ongoing debate surrounding the league. That does not mean every interpretation was correct. It does not mean Sophie literally turned the podium into a one-player attack. But it does explain why so many people instantly read it that way. That is what social media does with moments like this. It fills in the blanks, it takes context and turns it into certainty. And once that process starts, the quote becomes bigger than the quote itself. Some people called her brave immediately. Some said she was dog whistling. Some argued she finally said what many athletes privately believe but are too careful to say publicly. And once all of those reactions hit at once, the story was never going back into a normal post-game box. Why this blew up far beyond basketball. The WNBA is not just a sports league in the public imagination. It sits at the intersection of sports, identity, politics, gender, representation, and culture in a way that few leagues do. That means a quote like this cannot stay contained. It instantly becomes more than basketball. People stop reacting as only fans. They start reacting based on worldview, based on values, based on what they think the league should represent. That is why this went nuclear so quickly. If Sophie Cunningham says this in some random off-season interview, it is still a story. But if she says it right after another high-attention Indiana game with Caitlin Clark once again at the center of officiating complaints and with Brittney Griner already part of the conversation orbit, then the whole thing explodes. That is exactly what happened. This was not just a player sharing an opinion. This was one of the most discussed personalities on one of the most discussed teams saying something culturally radioactive at a moment when the league was already under a microscope. That combination guarantees heat, and now the WNBA has to deal with that heat on top of everything else already surrounding Indiana, because this did not replace the Caitlin Clark conversation. It landed directly on top of it. the Caitlin Clark layer underneath all of this. And this is the part that made the whole situation even more combustible. Caitlin Clark had already spent the game at the center of the exact kind of conversation fans are tired of having: contact, no calls, frustration, and then a technical that many viewers felt made far less sense than the actual physical plays that had gone uncalled earlier in the night. That contrast is what keeps driving the anger. Clark gets bumped, Clark gets grabbed, Clark gets hit driving to the basket. Many Fever fans have argued that Clark receives heavy contact without enough fouls being called, while others disagree with that assessment. Nothing. Then she reacts to something smaller, a point, frustration, visible emotion, and suddenly the whistle shows up. That sequence has become one of the defining frustrations of her WNBA experience so far. To her fans, it feels like she is being told to absorb contact quietly while also being judged more harshly for showing competitiveness. That creates a trap. If she says nothing, people act like the physicality is normal and she should just accept it. If she reacts, people act like the reaction is the real problem. Either way, the spotlight comes back to her, and because it keeps happening, the emotional temperature around every Fever game is already high before anything else gets added to it. So when Sophie Cunningham then walked into the postgame and made a statement this loaded, it did not land on neutral ground. It landed after another night where Clark's supporters felt like they had watched the same pattern happen again. That does not automatically mean the officiating was malicious. It does not prove some grand anti-Clark agenda. But it does mean the perception around her is already extremely charged. And in sports, charged perception can be just as powerful as hard proof. That is what made Sophie's comments feel less like one isolated quote and more like another escalation in an already heated season. Why Sophie's role matters so much. One reason this resonated the way it did is because Sophie Cunningham has gradually become more than just a veteran role player in the eyes of fans. She has become symbolic. To some people, she is the teammate who does not hide, the one who says what others avoid saying, the one who visibly rides for her teammates instead of retreating into safe answers. That image did not start with this quote. It had already been forming. Fans have watched her defend teammates. They have watched her criticize officiating. They have watched her lean into controversy instead of shrinking from it. So by the time this moment arrived, people were already ready to attach bigger meaning to whatever she said. That is how sports personalities grow beyond their stat line. It stops being about points per game and starts being about what fans think you represent. Right now, to a lot of people, Sophie represents bluntness, loyalty, and a refusal to play the overly polished media game. That is powerful. It is also dangerous. Because once people see you that way, every future quote carries more weight. That is exactly what happened here. Even people who disagree with her were still paying attention. And in today's sports media environment, attention is power, especially when it feels authentic. The basketball got overshadowed, and that says everything. What makes this whole thing even crazier is that Indiana absolutely torched Connecticut. 123 points. That should have been the story. That kind of offensive explosion is not supposed to get pushed into the background, but it did. And the fact that it did tells you everything about how emotionally loaded this team has become. Because this was not just one player going off and dragging a team to the finish. This was a full-on offensive avalanche. Clark gave Indiana pace, shot creation, and scoring. Aaliyah Boston gave them inside control. Kelsey Mitchell brought her usual scoring pressure. The team moved the ball, spaced the floor, punished mistakes, and made Connecticut look overwhelmed. At halftime, Indiana had already dropped 70 points. That is absurd. That kind of scoring should dominate every headline, every recap, every show the next morning. And yet by the end of the night, one of the biggest talking points was still Sophie Cunningham's post-game answer and what fans thought it meant. That is not normal. That is what happens when the basketball itself is happening inside a much larger cultural storm. Indiana is not just playing games right now. Indiana is carrying storylines. Every Fever game now has multiple layers. The score, Clark's treatment, the officiating, the media reaction, the veteran reaction, the fan reaction. And now, on top of all that, whatever Sophie Cunningham says next, that is a lot, and yet the team keeps winning through it. That may be the most important part. Why Indiana looks more dangerous than ever, lost in all the controversy, is maybe the biggest basketball takeaway of all. Indiana looks legitimate, not just entertaining, not just famous, not just social media huge. Legitimate. They can score in waves. They can play through Clark in space. They can run offense through Boston inside. They can get scoring from Mitchell without forcing it. They can stretch teams. They can move quickly from defense to offense. And increasingly, they look emotionally connected. That matters because the best teams do not just survive controversy. They often get sharper through it. And right now, Indiana looks like a team that is turning external noise into internal clarity. Clark is the star. That is obvious. But this is no longer just Clark and everybody else. Boston matters too much. Mitchell matters too much. The collective identity matters too much. That is why a 123-point night is such a big deal. It is not just proof that Clark is electric. People already knew that. It is proof that the Fever are becoming dangerous as a whole, and if they are learning how to play through this level of attention and still look this organized, then the rest of the league has a very real problem coming, because that means Indiana is not being derailed by the circus around it. It is learning how to use it. Why this matters for the rest of the season. Now zoom out. This is no longer just about one quote. It is about what happens when one player already tied to the biggest storyline in the league says something that detonates a second storyline on top of it. That creates pressure everywhere. Pressure on the league office, pressure on broadcasters, pressure on sponsors, pressure on teammates, pressure on other players who now have to choose whether to speak, stay quiet, or split the middle carefully. That is what moments like this do. They do not just create headlines, they force alignment. People start choosing sides. Not always publicly, but internally they do. What kind of league should this be? How much should athletes say? How much should the league step in? How much can the WNBA grow while holding this much cultural tension at the same time? Those are not small questions, and now they are sitting right on top of a Fever team that keeps winning. That is what makes this so important going forward. Every Indiana game from here on out will carry more eyes, more commentary, more interpretation, more attempts to turn basketball moments into something much larger. And the Fever are going to have to navigate all of it while still trying to become a true contender. So far, they look like they can, and that may be what scares the rest of the league most. Because if this team can absorb all this noise and still keep building chemistry, rhythm, and confidence, then the basketball problem Indiana poses is only getting bigger. The real takeaway. So what actually happened here? Sophie Cunningham gave a calm, direct post-game answer that immediately exploded into one of the biggest debates in women's basketball. Fans connected it to Brittney Griner because of timing and context. Others saw it as a broader statement about fairness in women's sports. The league now has another controversy layered on top of an already volatile season around Caitlin Clark, and all of it happened after Indiana scored 123 points and looked more dangerous than ever. That is the real story. Not just one quote, not just one game, not just one player. A quote, a team, a star, and a league all colliding at the same moment. And if things are already this loud now, the rest of the season is only going to get more intense from here. Whether you agree with Sophie Cunningham or not, one thing is undeniable. Every Indiana Fever game now creates headlines that extend far beyond the final score.